As a specialist in the payroll space for businesses that fall under the SCHADS award, we found that many employers are under the impression that if they pay their staff above the suggested minimum wage, then whatever is in the award in terms of other payments doesn't apply. That's incorrect, and you risk a heavy underpayment claim. Not knowing what overtime rates you should be paying can mean that your business may be subject to major back pay claims, penalties, and scrutiny by the Fair Work Ombudsman, not to mention potential bad publicity and reputational risks. Fair Work love to name and shame. So, in this fifth part of our SCHADS online course, we'll break down what is reasonable time, how overtime rates are calculated, how time off instead of overtime works, consecutive hours off and breaks during overtime, all things that catch business owners off guard. Also, make sure you check out our playlist containing the rest of the course. I've left a link in the description box below. And if you work in a business under the SCHADS award and you need to include this as part of your CPD or you need a certificate, we have a paid version of the course that will also issue you a certificate when you complete the course. It also includes bonus tools like our SCHADS compliance checklist to help you with processing payroll. And we keep the course 100% updated as changes come through with the SCHADS award. I've also left links to access it below. Let's get into it.
Under the SCHADS award, you can ask an employee to work reasonable overtime. An employee must get paid overtime rates if they work more than their maximum ordinary hours. SCHADS shift workers don't have a set spread of hours, but if a day worker works outside their spread of hours, they should also receive overtime. So what is reasonable overtime? Overtime can be reasonable as long as you take the following factors into account before asking an employee to work beyond their ordinary hours. Number 1, health and safety risks. Number 2, the employee's personal situation, like family responsibilities. Do they have children they need to pick up from school? Number 3, the workplace needs. Is it entirely necessary for the employee to work overtime? Number 4, overtime rates, which we'll discuss later in this video. Number 5, notice of overtime. It could be unreasonable to ask an employee 30 minutes before their shift ends to work another 3 hours. Number 6, has your employee previously mentioned that they can never work overtime? And number 7, the usual patterns of work in the industry. If your employee doesn't feel like you've considered these factors and that overtime is unreasonable, then they are allowed to refuse to work the overtime you've requested.
Once you've established that the overtime is reasonable, you'll need to pay your staff the proper overtime rates. You can't just pay them a little bit extra and hope for the best. You need to pay them according to the specified rates in the award. Full-time employees working in the daycare, home care, and disability services sector must be paid 150% of their ordinary rate for the first 2 hours and 200% after that if they work overtime between Monday and Saturday. Full-time employees working in the social services, community services, and crisis accommodation sector must be paid 150% of their ordinary rate for the first 3 hours and 200% after that if they work overtime between Monday and Saturday. The overtime rate for full-time employees working under either of the sectors should get paid 200% regardless of how many hours they work. With part-time employees, they must get paid overtime if they work more than 38 hours in a given week or 76 hours per fortnight. The rates are the same, 150% of the ordinary rate for the first 2 hours and 200% after that. For example, Katie is a part-time employee in the home care sector, and she usually averages around 32 hours per week. Last week though, she ended up working around 40 hours. So for 6 of those hours, she'll be paid her normal rate, and for the extra 2 hours after that, she'll need to be paid 1.5 times her normal hourly rate. On Sundays, however, it'll be 200% for the entire overtime period and 250% if the overtime period is on a public holiday. Now, you may not realize it, but casual employees are also entitled to overtime. If your casual employee works more than 10 hours per shift, they must also be paid an overtime rate of 150% of their ordinary rate for the first 2 hours and 200% after that, plus their casual loading of 25%. If you or your employee would prefer time off instead of overtime payment, you can agree to do so. But there are a few conditions. The employee must be allowed to take off time off equal to the number of overtime hours worked. For example, 2 overtime hours at a penalty rate of 150% would still mean 2 hours off. The employee must take time off within 3 months from the time the overtime was worked.
Another condition of overtime work is that the employee should get at least 10 consecutive hours off from the time they've finished their overtime until the next shift starts. So start times might need to be adjusted. You'll also need to give them breaks while working overtime. If your employee works more than 4 hours overtime, they must have a 20-minute meal break and another 20-minute break for each upcoming 5 hours overtime. All of these breaks must be counted as time worked, and the meals must be free of charge. So there you have it, all the overtime rules and regulations so that you can make sure you're compliant under the SCHADS award. See you in the next module.